Okay, let's wrap up our module on the political and religious background of the Gospels by talking about some of the groups, trends, and literary sources that are important for our understanding. So, Mark Strauss says that while groups like the Pharisees and Sadducees are usually identified as religious parties, they were really both religious and political in purpose and beliefs. Because Israel's national identity was fundamentally religious, revolving around the foundations that we'd already talked about, monotheism, covenant, and Torah, the religious and political aspirations of these groups cannot be separated. So as we understand these groups that we read about over and over and over in the New Testament, we got to understand that they are not just religious groups, but they are political in interest as well. So some key groups within Judaism, let's talk about them. The first group we want to mention is the Sadducees. So the Sadducees came from the priestly Hasmonean, that upper-class Jewish Hasmonean culture who liked the Roman status quo. This was a group that was much more open to Hellenistic ideas and culture than some of the other groups. Strauss says the Sadducees were the party of the status quo, content with the order and stability brought by the Romans. This resulted in theological conservatism. They considered only the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of Moses, to be fully authoritative scripture, denying the oral traditions of the Pharisees. This may be in part because the historical books of the Old Testament describe the establishment of the Davidic dynasty, and the prophets predict its future restoration. The Sadducees were not looking for a Messiah king from David's line who would threaten their political power. The Sadducees also differed from the Pharisees by rejecting belief in predestination or determinism. They rejected the immortality of the soul as well as the resurrection of the body. Because of their political involvement, they were more open to Hellenistic influence than the Pharisees or the Essenes. And since the Sadducean power base was the priesthood and the temple, the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in AD 70 ended their political influence, and the group disappeared from history. So it's really important to understand that the Sadducees, their power base was the temple, whereas the other more prominent group, which we'll talk about now, the Pharisees, their power base was much more in the synagogue community. So let's talk about the Pharisees. Now, we've mentioned before that the Pharisees, they arose from those Hasidim, those ones who faithfully united in the Maccabean revolt to free the Jews from the oppression of the Seleucids. They were very conservative, and they were trying to protect and adhere to the Torah as well as the oral traditions. So the Pharisees are trying to be very faithful to what makes Jews Jewish. And so one of the most distinct characteristics of the Pharisees was their strict adherence to Torah. Not only the written law, but also the oral law, which will become very important as Jesus gets in their face throughout the Gospels. But the oral law was a body of traditions that expanded and elaborated on the Old Testament law, often called, as we see here in Mark 7:3, the tradition of the elders. So it's not necessarily just what was written down in the Old Testament, but it was the oral traditions that surrounded and that kind of expanded beyond those that also the Pharisees treasured and tried to protect, and which is why Jesus came in conflict with them so often. But according to some rabbinic traditions, both the written and oral law had been given to Moses on Mount Sinai. So therefore, the Pharisees' goal was twofold. One was to apply Torah's mandates to everyday life, and 2, to build a fence around Torah to guard against any possible infringement. And boy, do we ever see that in the Pharisees' discussions and conflicts with Jesus in the New Testament. So that's who the Pharisees were. They were conservative, and they strictly adhered to the Torah and the oral tradition. Okay, let's talk about number 3, the Essenes. So the Essenes also arose from the Hasidim, but they were even more separatistic than the Pharisees. And the Essenes would leave, and they would live in their own communities because they believed that the whole Jerusalem priesthood was corrupt. And so they separated themselves away from the Jerusalem power base entirely. In fact, many believe that the desert community in Qumran, who gave us the Dead Sea Scrolls, could have most likely been Essenes who were responsible for that. But a fourth group that's important to understand are the Zealots. And so there was a lot of groups that were revolutionaries that everybody hated the Roman influence, but the Zealots were the ones who were fighting back against it. These were revolutionaries, these were social bandits, and they actively sought to overthrow Rome. They used guerrilla warfare. So these were the ones who were very much opposing aggressively and violently the Roman threat and the Roman presence. And so there's actually even more groups, but here we can see from the Four Portraits book kind of a spectrum of the pro-Roman side, which we didn't mention, but there was a group also called the Herodians, very, very pro-Roman, all the way down to the Zealots, which were very, very anti-Roman. And you can see the Sadducees, Pharisees, and Essenes kind of in the middle there on that spectrum. So if we even just understand some of the basics about these groups, this will help us understand their role as we read and study the New Testament. So that's a little bit on the groups within Judaism. Most important ones, Sadducees, Pharisees, Essenes, and Zealots. But along with that, we want to talk about some trends. There were two really important trends within Judaism that were at play. So the first one was called apocalypticism. And what this means is basically end-time related movements, meaning that there was a very strong undercurrent of belief that God was going to intervene, and he was going to save the Jews from the oppression of the Roman Empire, and he was going to intervene in human history in a dramatic way. And there was this expectation of God's intervention. That would be classified under apocalypticism. But another one was this messianic expectation, this promised deliverer that we have been reading about all throughout the Old Testament, a Messiah king from the line of David who was going to come and rescue the people. So again, these two ideas were constantly in people's minds in the background of first century Judaism. It's important to know that as well, both apocalypticism and this expectation, this strong desire to be freed from a messianic leader were very key beliefs and trends within Judaism. But also quickly, we want to mention some of the key literary sources. So here just is a very short list of some of the most important literary sources. We're not going to get into it. Just know about these as we go forward. Okay, so the most important is Josephus. Josephus was an interesting figure. And he was the most prolific and important Jewish historian. Without Josephus, we would not know many, many, many things. But Josephus was a real interesting character that Mark Strauss really gives a great portrait of in his Four Portraits book. But he was a historian, he was an aristocrat, he was a propagandist. But Josephus was such a gift to our understanding of first century life. Another one was Philo. He was a Jewish scholar from Egypt, and he really gave us insights on how the Jews blended Hellenistic and their Jewish worldview together. He was actually 20 BC to 50 AD, as Philo is another literary source that gives us insight into the background. Of course, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, the greatest manuscript discovery in history, discovered between 1947 and 56 in the Qumran Desert, probably from the Essene community. And then there's also the Apocrypha and other rabbinic writings, which were Jewish writings apart from the New Testament. They have their own story. We're not going to get into that here. But these are important background pieces to understanding the religious and the political setting. So just review what we've talked about. It's been a lot in this session. So we're going to conclude our part one of the life of Christ. But here we've talked about the Herodian dynasty. We've talked about some key events, the Jewish revolt and the Bar Kokhba revolt. We talked about some of the core Jewish beliefs, monotheism, covenant, and Torah. We've talked about the temple, how significant the temple was, one of the first pillars of Judaism. The second was the synagogues, the synagogue communities, and the study of the Torah. And then lastly, in this video, just looked at some of the groups, trends, and literary sources in first century life. This is a flyover. You should definitely read the more in-depth treatment that Mark Strauss gives in Four Portraits, One Jesus, because it's a gift. But that's going to wrap up our part one of the life of Christ. So we've covered a lot in this course, so this part one. So we have 7 modules. We started off by asking, what are the Gospels? Number 2, how do we get the Gospels? We looked at the prologues and genealogies, followed by the historical setting of the Gospels. We looked at John the Baptist's birth being foretold, Mary receiving the news of Jesus' birth, and then in this module, number 7, the religious and political background of the Gospel. So that's going to wrap up part one of the life of Christ. And so as we go forward now, let's now continue with part 2 on the life of Christ, a chronological, theological, historical, and literary study of the Gospels.